Okay. Okay, I think it's time for us to go on. Once again, for those who didn't join us before, welcome to our official online launch of the new report. Very fresh, timely report that we put on our website only today. It's with a focus on technology. It's a little bit funny that we have technical problems right now, but maybe thanks to this, we will remember this launch better. I know how precious our time is, so I will not repeat everything what happened already before. Let's go straight to the presentation of Carl Soderberg, our head of policy and communications. He is the person standing behind the report. He will explain us why MRG decided for such a topic of the report this year. Carl, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you as well to all of our speakers. I'm really delighted that all of you could join us today, and also everyone who's joining us via Zoom or hopefully Facebook in the near future. What I want to do in these 10-15 minutes or so is review some of the contents of this report. And just to answer Anna's question, every year we issue our Minority and Indigenous Trends report, where we try to distill a key concern of minorities and Indigenous peoples around the world. And this year, we wanted to focus on technology in all of its dimensions, both the negative, the control aspects, the bias aspects, and also the positive aspects. Technology as a means of mobilizing thousands, and now we've seen millions of people fighting for change. So that's what we're trying to encompass in our report. We're very privileged to have the forward by Tendai Achiume, UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism. I do encourage you to read her very wise comments. We were hoping that she would join us today. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to, but we're hoping that she'll be able to join one of the forthcoming webinars in a series in which we'll be wanting to explore different aspects of the report. Now, ahead of our presentation today and discussion, I was reflecting on what some of the key themes of the report are. And aside from what Ulla Antti will be talking about after me, which has to do with the huge costs and damage and harm being done to Indigenous peoples and minorities in the obtaining of rare minerals and cobalt and copper to create the computers, the smartphones, the tablets that we're all using. I'll let Ulla speak about that. I'm going to focus on some of the other themes, and these are, I've distilled it down, access, surveillance, bias, the use of social media to spread hate, and finally, wanting to end on a positive note, the use by minority and Indigenous activists to document and to mobilize participation. So with regard to access, there is very clearly a digital divide around the globe between rich and poor, but there is also an even stronger digital divide between majorities and minorities. And here, for instance, I've taken a few examples. In Bulgaria, for instance, over 40% of Roma could not afford access to the internet or purchase a computer or a smartphone in 2016. And we know also that lack of access to the internet has really terrible and serious repercussions as more and more information and access to essential services goes online. And we've been receiving reports from Roma activists throughout Europe about how pressing this is, particularly now during the pandemic, when they, through this, because of the lack of access to internet, they aren't accessing public health information, and children who have been kept out of school are unable to access online learning. We have another form of lack of access, and that's in China, where Uyghurs are actively barred from pursuing university degrees in science and technology. And grievously, if there are Uyghurs who are wanting to study these fields and pursue degrees in other countries, then they put their family members back in China, in Xinjiang province, for instance, at grave risk of harm, because that's one of the factors that feeds into the algorithm that the Chinese authorities are using in their surveillance techniques targeting Uyghurs. We'll be hearing from Pratima in more detail, but we have a case study, an excellent case study written by her on indigenous persons with disabilities in Nepal, where she outlines the barriers to accessing assistive technologies. And these include administrative obstacles, physical distances, unaffordability, and cultural inappropriateness. Finally, we have to remember that the internet is being actively policed by governments around the world. So for instance, in 2019, there were 213 internet shutdowns, with over half in India alone. Now, of course, those may be targeting majorities as well as minorities, but for instance, in India, there was a grievously long internet shutdown of Kashmir. And they're, of course, targeting a particular community. And what internet shutdowns do is that they create a climate of impunity, because it means that victims of human rights violations are unable to document, unable to communicate with the outside world effectively. So that's access. Going on to surveillance, this is a very stark photo, a readout from a facial recognition tool used by the Chinese authorities to survey people for their ethnicity. And that's just one part of something that is called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, that's collecting massive amounts of data: hair color, height, religious beliefs, also what I mentioned before about family members having studied abroad. And this is then combined with DNA samples, fingerprints, iris scans, and blood samples. And this is specifically targeting Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But we're seeing now that the Chinese authorities are rolling that out around the country. So for instance, in 1 month alone, in April 2019, police in one city ran facial recognition surveillance to determine if residents of a city were Uyghurs 500,000 times. That's just 1 month. Going on to another example, we have here in the UK, I'm sitting in our London office, the Metropolitan Police, that's the London Police, have been running for a number of years now, something called the Gangs Matrix program, which is compiling a list, a database of gang members. And I should say that the conceptualization of gang is already very racist, as we see as it's expressed in the Gangs Matrix, because they are drawing on social media use and music listening habits, and thereby disproportionately targeting young Black men as young as 12 years old. And there was a Freedom of Information Act request last year to then receive the contents of the Gangs Matrix. And as a result, we were able to see that about 80% of those found on the Gangs Matrix last year were listed as African Caribbean, while only 8% were listed as white European. Moving on to another aspect of the criminal justice system, another serious area of concern is how AI, artificial intelligence, is being applied in pre-trial risk assessments. And this is to do with the risk of reoffending, and the term is recidivism. One such tool, Compass, is twice as likely to assign higher rates of recidivism, the risk of reoffending, for actually non-reoffending Black defendants than white defendants. And a further problem here is the lack of transparency. Judges receive readouts of the Compass, which they have in front of them, but defendants and lawyers do not necessarily receive that information themselves. So this kind of bias is reflected in other aspects of technology, for instance, social media. And last year is a clear example of this. Targeted ads in the US on Facebook for grocery shop cashier positions were shown to audiences of 85% women, while taxi driver jobs were shown to audiences that were 75% Black. And all of this raises the question of who actually designs these algorithms. And the clearest statistics we found were from within a specific sector, the global game industry, because there's a global association there that runs surveys. And people who identify as white, Caucasian, or European comprise 68%, and only 27.8% identify as female, transgender, or other gender identity. And indigenous people represented a mere 2% of those in that sector of the tech industry. So as I say in the heading here, and I draw that, I'm quoting one of our authors, Michael Castor, bias in leads to bias out. That's the simple truth of it. So those are some of the themes. Another theme I want to raise with you, and that is a focus of the report, is hate, the dissemination of hate via social media platforms in different countries. And we have an excellent case study written by Shakuntala Banerjee and Ram Bhatt at the LSE, who have been studying WhatsApp in India, and especially its role in driving Hindu vigilante violence against Muslims, Dalits, and other minority and indigenous communities in that country. And as you know, there have been absolutely horrific cases of literally lynchings where driven by conspiracy theories around, for instance, so-called cow slaughter to protect cattle. I use quotation marks there. And also child abduction is another conspiracy theory that is driving this violence. So Banerjee and Bhatt developed a typology of a social media fueling violence, and they categorize it they developed 4 categories. One is overwhelming content, creating a sense of shock. And this can be yes, indeed, videos and photos of violent incidents, but it can also be content to do with, for instance, natural disasters and so on. Simply shocking content generally. Then, of course, the conspiracy theories and stereotypes I've described. But very interestingly for me, as editor, I was struck by this, that there is also quite a bit of miscellaneous content, a constant flow of information to create a feeling of legitimacy, a branding, if you will, amongst these WhatsApp groups. So that can be information about local events and so on. And finally, highly gendered content, where women who may be active online face online harassment and threats. I want to end now more positively, exactly around documentation and participation. And this photo comes from a case study focusing on Baka community members in Cameroon who use a mobile app in order to document and mobilize against illegal logging and poaching. And there you see community members were involved in designing the app, creating those symbols, and they can then document and feed on information in order to get assistance. But I want to especially focus on Black Lives Matter and point out how social media can be a fantastic driving force for mobilization. And you'll all, of course, be very familiar with Black Lives Matter now. It was devised in 2013 by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. It went from an average of 17,000 times a day in 2018 to 8.8 million times 3 days after the terrible killing of George Floyd on 25th of May, 2020. And in fact, it remained for the subsequent 2 weeks at around 3.7 million times a day. And that, of course, led directly to the mobilization of literally millions of people all around the world calling for justice and for change. So a very powerful example of how social media can be used to seek change. But I have just a couple more examples before I finish. I've mentioned the indigenous Baka already. In Ecuador, we have a case study concerning indigenous activists employing social media to disseminate information on COVID-19 in indigenous languages. But I'd like to end with a personal favorite of mine, which is digital games. And this is a digital game, Thunderbird Strike, where participants can combat the evil and wicked oil pipeline snake. Of course, you'll know that in the US and Canada, oil pipelines are a key issue of concern for Indigenous community members. So this game was designed by Elizabeth Lapensee, a media professor at Michigan State University, and she designed it specifically expressing her own Anishinaabe and Metis worldviews through digital game design. And she was wanting to transmit indigenous storytelling, ways of knowing, storylines, and so on, in order to create, as she called it, a self-determined space. Now, she met criticism, no surprises here, from Republican politicians and oil industry officials for promoting quote unquote eco-terrorism. But Lapensee emphasizes that perhaps the critics should play the game themselves before immediately starting to criticize. And I think I'll end my presentation by quoting her. So her desire is to create self-determined spaces for the expression of our identities on our own terms. And that is as powerful a message as I can think of when it comes to technology and minority and indigenous people's rights.
Carl, thank you very much. I know that some people already now have questions to you after the presentation. Please, everybody, write down your questions for later, or maybe put them to the chat immediately. I will use this moment when Carl finished to say official hello to everybody who joined us a bit later. We are extremely sorry for all the technical issues that appeared. You know, our new report is about the challenges of technology. So, you know, we wanted that you will remember this launch better because it's about technology and you can see how technology might disappoint us. We will try to go on with the program as we planned. Of course, thank you for joining even on Zoom. We wanted to have the Facebook Live, but something didn't work. Thank you especially for all the speakers, for your patience, for your waiting and smiling to camera still. Thank you, Carl, for getting into details of our report. Our report has 3 thematic chapters and 22 case studies from all over the world, from all the continents. This is, of course, not all the examples we could find or we are working on. This is just the inspiration for all of you to think about your own country and look around to see if you see examples like this in your countries. I would like to invite now our colleague and friend, Ola Antilaba. He is a lawyer from Sami Council, Human Rights Unit. Ola wrote one of the chapters for us about Norway. That's not the first time we cooperate. I would like to say hello to Inari in Finland. Ola, can you hear us?
Thank you very much, Anna. Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Good day, everyone, in Sami language. So, I'm very delighted to join again to Minority Rights Group EU report launch. Actually, some of you might know me, or we have met before. I was doing an internship in MRG in London in 2017. So I was working at the London office for 4 months. And I belong to the Sami indigenous people, indigenous nation. Our traditional lands are in Scandinavia and in Kola Peninsula. But nowadays, the states and the state borders have divided us so that we now live in Finland and Sweden and Norway and Russia. So I usually say that I carry Finnish passport, but I'm a Sami person. Last year, the theme of the Minority Rights Group's year report was climate justice, and I wrote a short report or case study about how climate change affects to traditional Sami livelihoods. And this year's theme focused on technology, and especially my case study, it's kind of neglected to the climate change topic. As you have probably seen, the headline of my this year's case study, it includes the term green colonialism. And well, I cannot say that I've invented this term, but it's kind of, I've noticed that this term is unfortunately, or I can say unfortunately, it's been, you can see it and hear it nowadays more often all over the world, I think. And I can say that this is kind of a new way of discrimination of minorities and indigenous peoples. As probably all of us know that like in this situation, what we have now, that we are living in climate change, and one of the key elements that is making the climate change is the carbon dioxide, this kind of what we have in air all the time. And one major source of carbon dioxide is the forms of energy forms what are common now. For example, coal and every kind of energy that pollutes the climate. And of course, in order to stop climate change, states and also energy companies have tried to find solutions for greener energy. And this has, for example, at least in Scandinavian countries, affected, so that there are many windmill power plants, and windmill power plants are being constructed, especially in the Norwegian side of the Sami land. Second thing is that, for example, battery technology, what we have, for example, in electrified cars is using materials like copper and so on, and these effects, so that unfortunately for the material source, companies are trying to find places for mines and for the mining industry. And in my case study, I can say that the main case is the mining project in the Repovuona area in Sami language in the northern part of Sami land, in northern part of Norway. There has been ongoing process of establishing copper mine. The process has been, if I remember correctly, it's been there about 10 years. And well, there has been already at the beginning heavy oppression from the local Sami community. They haven't accepted the mining plans. And one major thing is that this would, if I say straight, then this would destroy the reindeer pastures, lands that people use and what the reindeer especially use. This would have concrete negative effects to the reindeer herding of the area where the mine is established. And the second thing is that there are plenty of, how would I say, risks that the mines, if it will be constructed, there would be plenty of kind of pollution that would affect to the water quality, because it's in the coastal side of Sami land, and this would also affect negatively to the fish population of the area. And fishing is the traditional Sami livelihood, such as reindeer herding, but of course fishing is also important food industry, not only in the northern part of Norway, but all over Norway. So this mining project has a heavy oppression, and I've interviewed one Sami activist for this case, and one Sami activist and politician who is a member of Sami parliament. And it is kind of, I can say, like off topic, that I I was writing this case study last spring, and it was April, May, and when I finished it, just like 3 weeks ago, I heard that there was also a mining project in my home community. There was this kind of a reservation made for mining purposes, and actually the reindeer herders of my community, they didn't have like any straight information from the company or from the authority or the authors who were kind of who gave this reservation permission for mining purpose, and this mining reservation had a huge impact to my own community, and there was one member of my reindeer herding district. He was very active, and she made this kind of address to resist this mining activity, and she gathered almost 40,000 names to, you know, who were resisting this this mining reservation activity. So it is kind of like it's kind of sad. It's almost every week or every month you hear these kind of new projects, plans, this kind of land encroachment plans, especially not only mining, but the windmill industry also. And the windmill industries now have been in Norway. There have been like plenty of several wind mill power plant plans, and I can just briefly say that the windmill power plants are like, they destroy the reindeer herding pastures, and the reindeer avoid completely. So if a windmill power plant comes to an area, that is lost pastures. You cannot have reindeer there anymore. I just noticed from the chat, do I have a, am I going, how do I say? Oh,
That was just a very little friendly reminder.
Okay. But and this is actually land encroachment issues is one of the things that I've been also working nowadays in my work in Sami Council's Human Rights Unit. So after when I've written, I started my work on last May, and actually I'm now, I think that I have kind of I would say wider understanding of this whole land encroachment thing that is happening all over the Sapmi now. But well, I don't have anything else to add. I just encourage you to read my case study, and of course read the whole MRG year report. And I would like to thank especially Peter, who I've been collaborating with this article. since last spring, and of course everyone else also from the MRG stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ola, very much. Thank you. Ola is staying with us, so whenever questions come, we will be able to address them. I would like to fly from Inari, from Finland, to Nepal. Pratima is with us. Pratima is a president of National Indigenous Disabled Women Association from Nepal, and the General Secretary of Indigenous Person with Disabilities Global Network. Pratima, would you mind telling us first just few sentences about what you are doing before we will get into your chapter?
Thank you, Anna. First of all, I would like to thank the MRG for providing me this opportunity to speak a few words on it. And secondly, I would also like to congratulate Minority Rights Group International for coming with this minority and indigenous trend report on technology. So I'm Pratima Gurung from Nepal, and I belong to Gurung indigenous community from my country. And I'm an indigenous woman with disabilities. And right now, we are, the whole world, including Nepal, is also going through this whole pandemic process. And we have been having different challenges related with indigenous people and also people with disabilities. And right now we are working on some of the response and recovery procedures and activities related with this indigenous persons with disabilities, including minority groups at Nepal. This is what I would say. Thank you.
And can you tell us, I'm sorry to ask you to do it shortly, I know that we can talk about it for a really long time, about how technologies are helping or not helping indigenous people with disabilities, on an example of Nepal, of course.
So for me, being the General Secretary of Indigenous Persons with Disabilities, I would not only confine my examples and my experience related with Nepal, because this is the reality of the whole global, where we have 54 million indigenous persons with disabilities all around the globe. And if we talk about the access to technology for indigenous people, also we find that there is a gap, and there is a relationship between technology and inequality, which is very much in a multifaceted form. We know that the technology has enhanced the productivity, accelerated economic growth, and many other things for many people. But when it comes to indigenous people and people with disabilities, we have seen on the ground that we are most often being left out. And when it comes to indigenous persons with disabilities, we see that there are many challenges that they face. Basically, the challenges which are related is inaccessibility, the social stigma they have related with different social services that they receive due to the inaccess of this technology, and that includes assistive devices for persons with disabilities. And I've also mentioned some of the informations related in this report about the procedural and also the access to informations related with indigenous peoples, which are in mother tongue language or local language for indigenous people, and also the sign language and plain language for persons with disabilities. So there are numerous challenges and inaccessibility related with technology for indigenous people and persons with disabilities. And when it comes to these challenges faced by these two dominant group, also we find that there are certain groups like indigenous persons with disabilities who belong to both these identities, and they are the one who have still more further challenges in accessing all these informations technology, and also related to their needs that is required for their daily lives. This is what I would highlight on.
Thank you very much. We come back to you in a moment. Now I would like to fly to Miriam, who is right now in Canada. Miriam Putik, she's the head of Middle East and North African program at Ceasefire Center for Civilian Rights. Miriam was great enough to write 2 chapters for our report. I think I will start with the Iranian one. Could you please tell us a bit about the biometric technology and what can it do to people?
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for the invitation to be here. I'm really glad to see the release of this report and grateful to be part of such an interesting discussion with so many speakers with such deep knowledge of the impacts of technology in their particular context. I think biometric technology is a really great example of kind of the double-sided nature of technology as something that both decreases inequality in some ways, makes life easier and more accessible and more efficient for citizens, and yet on the other hand also has the potential to increase inequality and also introduce new threats to privacy, to security, and to various other rights of individuals. So biometric technology, as many people are familiar with, involves the collection of personally identifying physical characteristics. So things like fingerprints, iris scans, voice recognition technology. These are all biological metrics that are unique and individual to the person. And because they're unique, they offer a lot of benefits in terms of security, in terms of access to everyday services. So for example, it's very easy to steal someone's password or to forge someone's signature. It's a lot more difficult to steal someone's voice or their iris scan. So in many countries around the world, including Iran, we've seen a move in recent years towards using biometric technology in many different aspects of daily life, including in national identification cards, which are then used also to constrict or limit access to different services, from banking, from pensions, from being able to get a driver's license. And so, of course, as I mentioned, this has many positive applications. On the other hand, there are a lot of concerns about what the collection of these types of data sets by governments mean in terms of privacy and in terms of people's individual security, particularly in Iran, where we've had a legacy or already an established practice of governments using people's personal data to actually enhance their own surveillance operations in a way that doesn't necessarily bode well for personal security. And another thing that was interesting in Iran with the rollout of these new cards was that it was coupled with actually increased discrimination, which was, in a way, it was a continuation of old patterns of discrimination, but that was made more effective with this new technology. So after Iran started rolling out these new cards, they announced in January, January of this year, that certain religious minorities would no longer be able to register as other on the card. So Iran right now only recognizes 4 main religious groups, so Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. Those are recognized in the constitution, and they have legally sanctioned rights and privilege across many aspects of the Iranian legal and political system. Other minority groups, so for example, Baha'is, Yarasan, Mandaeans, other smaller minorities don't have that same protection, but they used to be able to at least register their identity as other on the field of these cards, even though their religion was not explicitly recognized. Now that's no longer the case, so people from these groups are forced to actually choose one of the 4 main religions that I mentioned already. And for many people, it's basically you have the choice of lying about your identity and hiding your identity in order to get this card, or you could choose to not get the card at all, which is actually not really a practical choice, because as I mentioned, this card is increasingly used and needed to access so many daily services. So and again, like even if they did have the option to register their religion, a lot of people have concerns about, well, what is that data going to be used for? Do I actually want the government to know my religion, and is that going to be used against me? So it just kind of goes to show how, on the one hand, you have these new technologies that are making life easier and are being promoted kind of across the board by different sectors. On the other hand, with the kind of longer standing inequalities and discrimination that exist, these technological tools just become new platforms or new ways in which those inequalities play out if they're not kind of regulated within frameworks that respect the rights of all people to use them equally and fairly.
Thank you, Miriam. I could listen to you all the time. Thank you. I will come back with the second question about your second chapter, but I would like still to fly first to Milka, to Kenya. Milka, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, Anna, I can. Hi.
Yes. Hi. Milka is a representative of Sangwer indigenous people community. Milka, I would like to ask you, we all know that Kenya is a shining star when it comes to the usage of mobile phones. I would like to know what it means for you and your community, and especially in those COVID times, especially in the late times, not easy for Sangwer people. As some of us know, maybe you can describe the situation a bit more in details, because maybe not everybody here between us know the situation.
Thank you, Anna, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. My name is Milka, as you've heard, from the Sangwer community. We are a forest indigenous community in Kenya, living in Kabolet Forest and in Embobut Forest in western part of Kenya. And for quite some time now, since the independence, since the colonial time until now, my community members, specifically in Embobut Forest, have been facing evictions for very many times from the government in the name of conservation. So our land was gazetted as a public forest by the British during colonial times. And so that was carried over to the independence government, and so was recognized as a forest reserve until now. And so for a forest reserve in Kenya, of course, the colonial laws and the independent laws do not recognize people living in forests. And so there've been continuous evictions for so long. And even currently, we are not allowed to still live in the forest, but we are still there, and that is why evictions is happening. And of course, technology, I will speak specifically on the information technology, the ones that enables people to communicate. Of course, technology came in to make people speak to each other, be able to check on each other from whichever side of that you are in, but most of the time, and often, of course, people living inside or people when inside the forest are not able to communicate from outside. To people from outside, or even know when the Kenya Forest Service guards are coming to attack any of the community members. So in as much as technology came in to facilitate communication, still a lot of people are not able to communicate. One, because there's no signal, because the area has been marginalized for so long, so much so that the infrastructure needed to facilitate communication is not there in the first place. And of course, getting phones is not something that everybody can afford in Kenya, especially from the indigenous communities, because the poverty levels are quite high. So I don't know, Anna, if you want me just to say the whole thing now about how then the negative and the positive effects of technology is, especially with that background?
That would be great. I know that it's not easy to do it fast, but I think it's very important for us to hear it.
Sure. So in this situation, then we have a number of us who are then the human rights defenders in our community. So we defend our rights to our land and the rights of our environment, of course, to remain intact, because we are hunter-gatherer community, and so having the forest the way it is to the best of our interest as forest indigenous communities, because then we depend on it for food, for honey, for medicinal purposes and all that. And over time, then speaking about the community rights to land has been such a great threat to the government, and specifically the government. And so in as much as we can speak to each other to be able to be alerted when insecurity is there, when someone is being attacked for speaking against the government eviction actions, still the communication is posing a lot of danger to us as human rights defenders, because then they are tracking our communications, tracking our locations. And actually one of us was really injured in 2018, January, when he was up in the forest recording the human rights violations happening, of course, during the evictions. And the fact that we have a lot of supporters outside Kenya who can then just receive the information and tell the world what is happening to the Sengwer community means that the government feels so uneasy and feels like we just have to go down and pick these people. It becomes so easy to just know that someone is there and they can track the locations of our phones. Yeah, of course, then when we had not received support from organizations that would tell us how to be safe on our phones, then it would be such a challenge. But still, even with strengthening the security systems, it's still dangerous for us to communicate through phones and to communicate through other means of communications, especially phones that are the smartphones. Of course, like you say, many people in Kenya have smartphones. So those of us who have smartphones then are easily tracked using our smartphones. But generally what I would say is the effect of technology in this case is, of course, the continuous marginalization of communities such as ours, because we do not have the infrastructure in place, and the government will not make any effort to put those infrastructure in place. One, because we live in the forest, so it is just a public land forest reserve anyway. There's no need of putting the infrastructure there, because it is not recognized as a place where people should live, but in real sense we are there. It's led to also a lot of marginalization of women and children, because you talk of poverty and even the eviction itself. If anyone of us have been reading about how it affects differently both men, women, or even children, you will find out that women and children are more disadvantaged. And in that case, when we are talking about people having the advantage to communicate with others, then women and children automatically become disadvantaged because of their inability to access the phones themselves. And of course, generally, as an indigenous community living inside the forest with all the marginalization of our areas, it means many people are not educated. And a lot of technological devices and systems and information needs education. And in that case, then a few of us benefit from the good of technology, the good things that technology brings about, because it needs that education that for over time, people have not been able to access. And of course, I say that it is being used to cause harm to most of us. And yeah, just to link something to the education part of it, there's a very, I don't know how I would call it, but I would call it very inhuman act of just assuming that indigenous people and their lack of education then means people do not consult us when planning activities, when planning anything to do with the forest, or even when they need to consult us on any development project. So there's kind of an automatic overlook of consultation of indigenous communities, just because they can say, you know, we met them somewhere and they can take photos, but in real sense, the language that is coming with the technology they use in terms of consultation is automatically something that cuts out communities that want to participate. And very, very importantly is during this COVID time, you find out that most governments now are of course going the way that we are going now, meeting people online for consultative meetings and everything else. And you find that there are many laws, regulations, policies, acts of parliament that have been passed at this time with the assumption of people having been consulted online and call that public participation. What about the communities in the forest, in the semi-arid areas of Kenya, who have no phones, who have no internet connection, who have no signal, who should have participated physically in giving their submissions to the reviews of laws, or even the drafting of the laws themselves. So if at all we will have a post-COVID period, then there'll be a lot that we will realize, all of us, that has left out minority communities across the world, because then the laws, the policies, and everything else have been done during a moment when they cannot go somewhere to participate in and give their contributions, neither can they access the Zoom calls that we are in now. So there's just a lot of challenges that come with it, despite the little good that brings benefits to minority and indigenous communities across the world, including my own community. So thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Milka, very much. It's just a brief intro, like all the others. I hope it will serve all of you as an inspiration to get into the chapters of our report. Miriam, I would like to come back to you, to the other chapter you wrote for us from Iraq and Syria. Here about the good side. So how online reporting tools can be useful in documenting human rights violations in a conflict. Could you tell us more, please?
Sure. So this kind of goes back to Carl, the last point that Carl made on his presentation about documentation and participation, and the ways in which technology in some ways has actually decreased the barriers to actually participating in certain debates and increased the diversity of voices that can be there in fields or in discussions or in platforms that were traditionally dominated by certain voices. So if we look at the way that human rights documentation, monitoring, and just the whole practice of human rights has evolved over the years, access to information and the ability to actually participate in those debates used to be more dominated by certain actors, especially governments, especially large media outlets. The actors who played the main role in human rights monitoring tended to be established institutions like UN mechanisms, like the major human rights organizations that tended to be based in Western countries and would produce information about other contexts, and that would kind of become what was known or what was being talked about in terms of violations or in terms of the situation going on in different places around the world. Nowadays, as we know with social media, theoretically anybody can document information, can publish it online, and can at some level make that information accessible to a global audience, not just to their own community or their own locality. And that makes it in some ways harder for governments to cover up what's going on, because everyone at any time has the ability to document information and to produce that and to watch what's happening. On the other hand, just because there's a lot of information being produced doesn't necessarily mean that all those voices are being listened to equally. It doesn't necessarily mean that every type of information is being privileged. And we, of course, still have many inequalities in the online sphere in terms of language, in terms of resources, and who actually has the ability to be heard and to have their concerns acted upon. But increasingly, especially in conflict zones where you have security barriers, you have access barriers that mean that journalists and international mechanisms cannot always access the territory where violations are taking place. In those situations, we have seen a trend towards more and more eyes being focused on social media, and more people are looking to just Facebook and Twitter and seeing what ordinary people on the ground are saying about what's happening in Syria or what's happening in Iraq. And more, though that content, those videos, those testimonies, that information is actually being channeled and being published in news and being seen as a more authoritative source of information than it has ever been. So at Ceasefire, a lot of the work that we've been doing over the past years is actually supporting that trend and actually making the information produced by civilians, whether it's being published on Facebook or social media or on blogs, making that authoritative and making civilians themselves, people on the ground, regardless of whether they are human rights experts or whether they have the qualifications, by virtue of being the people who are there and who are witnessing violations or experiencing violations, making their voices authoritative. And so the case study kind of explains an online tool that we've developed that kind of seeks to bridge the gap between, on the one hand, it's a tool that anyone can access, that you can get from your smartphone, from Facebook or on the web. On the other hand, it's tailored specifically to documenting human rights violations and violations of the laws of conflict in a way that makes it usable, that makes it verifiable, and that can be taken seriously by international actors and by people who actually have the power to make change in those situations. And the tool is available in Arabic and English, which was important for us, making it available in the language, people's native language. Of course, there's a lot more that can be done in making it accessible to other languages as well. And we use that tool as kind of a channel for information coming in from people on the ground that can then be translated into action and into recommendations. So if I can just give one example of where we've used it really effectively, particularly over the past year or two, in Afrin in northeastern Syria, which is a really great example of a situation in which human rights violations are taking place in broad daylight with very little international knowledge or awareness of what's happening. Afrin is an area that's been under Turkish occupation since 2018. Almost the majority of the Kurdish population of the area has been pushed out. People have lost their homes, people have been killed, and people are afraid to return. And it's really remarkable the lack of information and oversight that's coming out of Afrin. There are basically no independent media outlets there. The UN mechanisms don't have access to the ground. There's very little actual monitoring and information of what's going on. So what we did just briefly is we trained several dozen activists from the area over the years. We got them to document what was going on through our tool. We collected several hundred testimonies and cases of what was going on, and we published that in a report that just came out this summer. And it's one of the few kind of windows onto what's been taking place in the conflict. And it's based entirely on testimonies of people directly on the ground without us ever actually going there or, collecting information in kind of the traditional, interview way. So it just shows how technology actually gives us an outlet into some of the most marginalized and areas in which there's the least amount of knowledge going on, and being able to overcome the really high security barriers that exist as well to make sure that the voices of what's happening are heard.
Thank you, Miriam. If we are already at the positive examples, I see questions popping up here, and there is a question to Pratima. Can you share the best practice on access to technology for indigenous persons with disabilities? What is the best way for us as individuals and organizations to support and promote best practices? Let's go to positive.
Okay, thank you. So for me, what I see from an indigenous persons with disabilities perspective is because we have been working not only in this COVID pandemic, but also equally in the normal situations, trying to bring the concept and the modality and also the identities within the indigenous communities and also persons with disabilities. And for me, as a best practice, we have been integrating in our organizations and in our work is also trying to bring the cultural appropriateness. And when we say cultural sensitive and appropriateness, one of the things that I would like to highlight with all of you is about the access to informations related with persons with disabilities. So we have different types of impairments, and we do need a different kind of needs depending on the severity of their impairment as a person with disabilities. But at the same time, we also find out and we also try to integrate what are the needs of indigenous people for accessing those information. So for us, the mother tongue language is very much required, and the plain language that we have been advocating for indigenous people and also persons with disabilities. So these are the examples of one of the best practices that we have been integrating right now at the community level. And the second thing that I would like to highlight is about, since we are indigenous people and also people with disabilities at the same time, and when we have these multiple identities and when these multiple identities get intersected, definitely there are many challenges that further excludes us in many spheres of life. But at the same time, we do have our own opportunities that how do we bring these challenges into our solutions. And for that, what I see is the cross-movement collaboration approach that we have been doing with the indigenous peoples movement and discourse at the national to the global level, and also with the disability discourse and movement at the global level is very much a good practice and knowledge and informations, because we do bring the issue of collective rights and individual rights at the same time and try to build the synergy when it comes to indigenous women with disabilities. So for us, it's not only with access to technology, but when it comes to the basic needs for indigenous persons with disabilities like health and educations and employment, all these things which are very much required in their daily lives for effectively and meaningfully participating in a society. We see that these basic needs, including all these aspects, are very much related to their meaningful participation and engagement. And this meaningful participation and engagement has been done with our advocacy, with the cross-movement collaboration approach. And the third thing that I wanted to highlight about the best practices is also bringing the evidences and also the testimonies from the ground related with indigenous persons with disabilities, and trying to integrate and incorporate the unique identities and the unique challenges as well as the solutions that indigenous persons with disabilities have at the community level. So these are the basic base practices that I would like to reflect, and we have been practicing these things. And while practicing all these best practices, one of the fundamental assumptions and the perspectives that we have been highlighting is about the intersectional approach, which is very much crucial when it comes to not only for indigenous persons with disabilities, but also other minority groups who are being left behind in this discourse. This is what I would like to highlight on. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratima. Oh, I already see that I made a mistake of inviting too many interesting speakers, because to each of you we can ask a lot of questions. I see that questions are popping up. I would like to remind everybody here, the publicum and also journalists joining us, that MRG tries to be this bridge between media and communities. So each of our guests can be approached with our help. Whenever you will have more questions to them, we are, and I'm personally very happy to be this bridge. Those chapters that we mentioned, those topics, those issues that we mentioned, are only examples. Yes, the report has 25 chapters. I also see here on our Zoom another author of one of the chapters, Alex Blocks, the author of the sign language chapter. Thanks for being with us. In this point, I also would like to thank you, Tina and Oliver, who are interpreting for us, as you probably noticed. I think because I would like to respect the time limits, and I know that some of our speakers have some other meetings very soon, so I will not get into all the questions posted on Zoom. I will come back to you later to find the answers, but I would like still all of us to look to the future and to look for things that can be done in the topic of making technologies be of a better use for us and for the minorities all around the world. I'm not sure, Carl, maybe you could mention a few of the recommendations that we included in the report. We always try to show not only the situation, but also good examples of what can be done. Maybe that would be the nice way to finish for now.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you as well. Heartfelt thanks to all of the speakers. Such an interesting discussion, and you've picked up so many different key themes in the report. I think for me, fundamentally, it has to do with how much technology is intruding into everyone's lives. And that this is happening in alliances between public authorities and private companies. And immediately when you step into that space between the public and private, you, one of the things that we don't fully get a grip on is the intrusiveness of all this, that all of those predictive technologies and so on are being used to determine, for instance, people's job applications, people's eligibility for social services, housing, you name it. And so in that private public sphere, I think that really, and several of you touched on this, it's critical to bring a human rights-based approach to these questions. And one thing that has struck me is that there's very little discussion of the tech sector from a business and human rights perspective. And so in other words, some of those key lessons from business and human rights apply equally to here. So that has to do with impact assessments at every stage, from the very beginning, the conceptualization of a technology, to its development, to its rolling out, to its evaluation, and so on. The other, and this is where we're in this murky private-public area, is the need for independent auditing. And that when governments procure these technologies, that they have to remain independently auditable, and that the persons being affected by them have to be able to get a real live human to appeal to for negative decisions. So it's those kinds of things that we have to bring to bear to this space. In other words, all that knowledge, all that learning from business and human rights to do with impact assessments, to do with auditing, to do with review, but especially, and I'll end here, I thought several of you were touching upon the importance of participation. and in order to pick up the nuances in terms of cultural appropriateness and so on. So that has to be taken seriously and at every stage of technological development.
Thank you, Carl, very much. Miriam, Pratima, Milka, Ola, would you like to say something for the end? Just unmute yourself. Pratima?
Yeah, okay. So I will just go the final remarks by saying that when it comes to indigenous persons with disabilities and also other minority groups, one of the challenges that we have been hearing and we have been experiencing on the ground is when it comes to technology, that most of the people, indigenous people, persons with disabilities and women with disabilities, they do not have this access to technology and including the accessible devices that is related with persons with disabilities. So for us, what we see not only in Nepal, but also in Asia is we need to have these evidences that even they do not have this access to technology, and we have numerous challenges faced by indigenous persons with disabilities. So for me, what I see is documentations and generating evidences of those inequalities and the barriers in accessing those technologies are very much crucial when it comes to indigenous persons and other minority groups. And the second thing that I would also want to highlight is about the meaningful participation and engagement of these indigenous persons with disabilities in these consultations, because we find that it's not only the consultations, debate, and the discourse on technology, but also in other discourse and also in other debates that most often indigenous people, including persons with disabilities, are being left behind. So these things has to be framed by a new narrative. This is what I see. And when we say that, when it has to be framed by a new narrative, I would again want to highlight about the cultural appropriateness and gender and disability inclusiveness is very much required when it comes to accessing technology, so that all people can access it and all people can achieve it to make their lives very much meaningful in their framework. This is what I would like to highlight, and also try to focus on these areas in coming days so that we could have discussion in coming days. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, thank you for joining us. The other speakers, would you like to say something still?
This is Roland Dave. I can just say briefly that climate change is affecting us all over the world, and it has serious negative impacts to indigenous peoples and their traditional livelihoods. And also I can say that I'm not, against, in principle, against, green technology, but this has serious effects to our livelihoods. The building, the construction work, the building of wind power plants, mines, it has serious negative impacts to our language and culture, and in every processes, indigenous rights and human rights must be respected. And for example, the principle of free, prior, and informed consent must be respected. And I just quickly, I saw there was a question about, about solutions on energy solution, and I can say I'm not an energy expert, and of course I believe that science and technology also can make our lives easier and For example, I think that we could make a huge improvement in recycling, recycling metals and so on. And I think that could be one solution, improve recycling technology. So thank you very much on my behalf.
Thank you. I hope each of us will reflect on what you just said much more every time we think about new good solutions, good for some, but maybe not so good for the others. Miriam, any final note?
Maybe I can just echo some of the points that Fatima has already said and some of the others as well. I think that there's sometimes a tendency to think of technology as being a purely modern issue that requires purely modern solutions. And I think that's, of course, sometimes true, and we do need specialized, regulation and specialized policies to deal with the particular challenges that technology poses. But on the other hand, I think a lot of the inequalities that we are speaking about in terms of access, in terms of participation, go back to, they're not new problems. It's, if you think about who has access to technology, who can actually use it effectively, whose voice can be heard, it goes back to things like literacy, who is literate, who can speak English or other dominant languages, who has spare time to create content and to actually be engaged in these discussions. And it's also a question of resources and wealth as well. I think social media is increasingly becoming a commercialized sphere, and the content that gets seen is the content that has the most money behind it and the most resources behind it. So when we're talking about, I think increasingly people tend to see technology now as a human right, and when we're talking about access to human rights, it's kind of the struggle that's very familiar to all of us in terms of reducing inequality and reducing discrimination and promoting things like education. So I think it's important also that technology doesn't get kind of pigeonholed into a specialized solution that requires, high-tech solutions. It's also a question about equality and access to the rights and to the struggle that we're all already engaged in by being people who are involved in human rights advocacy.
Thank you, Miriam. Milka, do you have anything for a final word for us?
Sure, Anna. Very interesting questions for me, and I have tried my best to just answer the people privately on the chat. But a very interesting one that just gave me a reason to throw back a reflection for all of us to have a look is how women and children specifically are being marginalized by the use of technology in consulting communities, or even generally in incorporating everyone in the development processes across the world. Of course, with practical examples from my community, like I said before, there have been a lot of discussions with development partners, with governments, and I'm sure this is how it is with other indigenous communities. And when it comes to using, of course, the English language or French or whichever other language that government officials and development partners are using to communicate to communities, and the use of phones and the use of laptops and the internet, we have to recognize that a major group that is left out is women and children who cannot be able to access these platforms. Mainly is for women because the reality of patriarchy across the world is so hard that even when women want to take part in this kind of meetings or in every other meeting that is crucial for any decisions that is made for their communities, then they may not be able to, because we have a lot of communities, including my own, that do not allow women to even own their own phones. Then how then do we make sure that at the end of the day we have an inclusion? So even when we think that an online meeting is inclusive and will reach as many people as possible, because then it will be an open meeting, We forget that there are people who do not have the infrastructure to join these meetings. We forget that even if they have the infrastructure, maybe it is that moment when a husband feels like this woman should not be having this phone at this moment, then they miss the whole discussion. So there's a lot to reflect when it comes to looking at minorities and the use of technology and how much it affects their participation in whichever sphere they would wish to be part of. Some of these things I will talk from experience is seeing women not being allowed to own these devices, these technological things. And so if this is the pace that the whole world is taking in the use of technology, then we should be all worried that at some point we will have a huge number of same gender women left behind. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important words for the end. Thank you all the speakers. Thank you, Milka. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Pratima. Thank you, Ola and Carl. Thank you very much for your presentation. Three last things, three last sentences for everybody from me. First of all, I wish that now you will take your time to go through our report in details. You can find it on the website of MRG in an online form and also as a PDF. I can guarantee that each chapter is as interesting and as every speaker here. Secondly, we are doing this report not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. So we would love to ask you to spread it, to talk about it, to give examples to your family and friends. We have a hashtag we would love to use. I'm posting it right now on the chat, Minority Trends 2020. And the last thing, this webinar is just the first webinar of the series we are preparing for you. In the next months, every two weeks, we will try to organize webinar. I promise you, looking from the technological perspective, it will be better. We will start on time and we will have a Facebook Live in place. We will learn on our mistakes. Thank you, everybody. Once again, as I promised, I will come back to your questions from the chat. I saved the chat. I will put you in contact with the right people. Thank you very, very much. And have a good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on the time zone where you are. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.